What'll it be, fellas?
How much for the phaser gun?
For the phaser gun? Sorry, Garfunkel. We don't hawk Trek here.
Phasers, lightsabers, tribbles.
First of all, Star Wars is derivative.
They seem kind of similar. They share 4-letter words.
First time they're about to die. They were swinging 30,000.
I sense a presence I've not felt in a long time. Nerds!
Star Wars is Walmart. Star Trek is like Neiman Marcus.
Han Solo's a bitch.
They're not at all the same.
Star Wars, the superior franchise.
Sorry, what did you just say?
Doesn't matter. There's no telepathy. It
Star Trek is the best. Everyone knows this.
sci-fi opera.
He said, quote, Star Wars.
Star Wars.
It's science!
Another stupid hero trope. I mean, what do you have in Star Trek?
I don't know. Does Star Trek have Jar Jar Binks?
I'm so sick. It was not.
What's wrong with Jar Jar Binks? Who doesn't fucking love Jar Jar Binks?
No. Cows, Han, Solo, a bitch!
Star Wars.
Who doesn't fucking love Jar Jar Binks?
Oxford Dictionary defines science fiction as fiction based on imagined future scientific or technological advances and major social or environmental changes, frequently portraying space or time travel and life on other planets. Author Alexander von Thorn called it the literature of ideas, but the genre's exact definition is still somewhat disputed. American science fiction author and editor Lester Del Rey wrote, "Even the devoted aficionado or fan has a hard time trying to explain what science fiction is. There are no easily delineated limits. The most succinct idea is probably best expressed by American naval officer, aeronautical engineer, and sci-fi author Robert A. Heinlein, who wrote, a handy short definition of almost all science fiction might read, realistic speculation about possible future events, based solidly on adequate knowledge of the real world, past and present, and on a thorough understanding of the nature and significance of the scientific method." Or did David Knight put it best when he said, "Science fiction is what we point to when we say it."
That is a most illogical attitude.
The debate over whether sci-fi is a modern invention or not has been going on for a while. One school of thought identifies the genre's origins in ancient poems, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, or even 1001 Nights, whereas another argues that science fiction only became realized sometime between the 17th and 19th centuries, following the scientific revolution and major discoveries in astronomy, physics, and mathematics. We often attribute the genesis of what we think of today as modern science fiction to Mary Shelley and her publication of Frankenstein in 1818. Many of the defining themes of the novel are synonymous with those that permeate the genre today, such as human ambition, responsibility, and the dangerous pursuit of knowledge that might be beyond our own real understanding, compassion, or patience. The book's subtitle is, after all, The Modern Prometheus. Shelley was interested in exploring the consequences of playing God. Frankenstein also heralds the beginning of deeper exploration of our fears about modern technology and industrialization, and that commonly tends to be the first thing that comes to people's minds when they hear the term sci-fi. iRobot, Terminator, Godzilla, The Fly, RoboCop, all of these stories bloomed out of this vision in one direction or another. But what ties them together is the fact that they are speculative. These are things that could theoretically happen. Cloning dinosaurs? Improbable, yes. But impossible?
You crazy son of a bitch, you did.
Prolific sci-fi author Isaac Asimov claimed that science fiction can be defined as that branch of literature which deals with the reaction of human beings to changes in science and technology. Sci-fi is also defined by the time period we live in. It's reactionary, and because it's representative of our anxieties and speculations, it's also ever evolving. In late 19th century Europe, it was all about the fear of being dominated by a foreign power after the unification of Germany and the Franco-Prussian War. In the 1920s, it was class division and extreme poverty. In the 50s, it was the commies. In the 70s, overpopulation and environmental destruction, and so on. So if the modern Prometheus is interested in how human nature might change, For better or for worse, what is the classical Prometheus representative of? Enter fantasy, the world of your Lord of the Rings, your Willows, Narnias, King Arthurs, Princess Mononokes, and Star Wars? Merriam-Webster succinctly establishes fantasy as something that tells a story about things that happen in an imaginary world, an idea about something far removed from normal reality. As opposed to sci-fi, fantasy is pretty inarguably as old as dirt. People have been telling fantastical tales since the dawn of time, not necessarily with the expectation that these events were plausible or true. This is the greatest distinction between the two. Though there is some overlap, fantasy generally strays away from scientific and more grounded themes, instead preferring to focus on things like magic, the supernatural, folklore, and historical elements. It's very easy to say that sci-fi depicts the future, whereas fantasy depicts the past. And while that's applicable to a lot of media within each genre, it's not always a solid rule. There is a lot more overlap than we generally realize. Going back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's arguably safe to designate it as a work of fantasy, but it's also considered to be one of the earliest science fiction texts in history. It's a little more complex than one or the other. This is precisely the reason why you see the genres lumped together all the time. In discussion, common thought, your local Barnes & Noble, they're almost like two sides of the same coin. So in the case of Star Wars, where exactly does it fit? At first glance, you'd probably want to say sci-fi. Just look at all those blinky dials and spaceships and robots. But the thing is, Star Wars doesn't really have any interest in speculating the human condition in regards to living amongst extraterrestrials, or the increasing presence of technology, or anything resembling what we generally consider the core themes of science fiction works. Arguably, the greatest kernel of sci-fi DNA in Star Wars makeup narrative-wise is Darth Vader's representation of the loss of our humanity through adoption of technological implants or upgrades. This is a cornerstone of the cyborg archetype. Star Wars, or at least George Lucas's Star Wars, has its roots in folklore and myth. Look no further than George's influence from Joseph Campbell. The original trilogy can be read as a mirror of the King Arthur story. The prequels are a Greek tragedy. The sequel trilogy is also a Greek tragedy, but in a different way.
They fly now! They fly now!
Star Wars is much more ingrained in fantasy tropes than it is in sci-fi, but naturally the series appears to sit at a sweet spot between the two genres, science fantasy. But the best label it fits under is arguably the space opera, a subgenre of science fiction that, quote, emphasizes fictional space warfare with use of melodramatic, risk-taking space adventures and chivalric romance. So it's a subgenre of a subgenre. But if it's a subgenre of sci-fi, then how is it different? Authors Geddes Hartwell and Catherine Kramer of the space opera Renaissance define it as a colorful, dramatic, large-scale science fiction adventure, competently and sometimes beautifully written, usually focused on a sympathetic, heroic central character and plot action, and usually set in the relatively distant future and in space or on other worlds. Characteristically optimistic in tone. It often deals with war, piracy, military virtues, and very large-scale action. It diverges from hard sci-fi in that there's a lack of emphasis on the effects of technological progress and inventions, and the narrative elements needing to obey the laws of physics, cosmology, mathematics, and biology. Star Wars begins with long ago and far away. It isn't looking to the future of humanity. Earth doesn't even exist in this universe. The point isn't to speculate on what we become once we reach the stars, it's an exploration of the traditional hero's journey in space. So why did I just spend so much time trying to convince you Star Wars isn't science fiction? Well, for one, it's kind of drilled into us based on hard perceptions of genre and what boxes we can squeeze certain stories under, that the series is objectively sci-fi because of its setting. But really what I'm interested in exploring is the age-old debate that seemed to plague the franchise ever since its inception. Star Wars versus Star Trek.
Throw this switch, and the Enterprise should answer.
Star Wars is just more people shooting guns at each other and wearing stupid outfits.
Star Trek, it is best enjoyed after you've graduated with a liberal arts degree.
Back in the era of The Addams Family, The Andy Griffith Show, and of course, Batman.
Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, how I wonder where you're at.
A man by the name of Gene Roddenberry was in the process of pitching his own television program, Star Trek, for network television, to both CBS and NBC in 1964. A pilot was produced for NBC, and though execs weren't enamored with the initial product, they actually paid for a second pilot. giving Roddenberry another chance to refine his vision. The second attempt was a success, and Star Trek was born. The show had 3 seasons over the course of its run from September 1966 to June of 1969, and even continued in the form of an animated series after its cancellation. Rod Serling of Twilight Zone fame offered a critique of the series in which he said, "Star Trek was again a very inconsistent show, which at times sparkled with true ingenuity and pure science fiction approaches. At other times it was more carnival-like, and very much more the creature of television than the creature of a legitimate literary form." But general audiences were engaged by the show, and it's safe to say that the series was in large part responsible for the growing presence of sci-fi in mainstream popular consciousness at the time. Star Trek was a show that had an interest in speculating, but as opposed to the vast majority of science fiction, which tends to tread the line between bleak and cautionary, Star Trek was pretty optimistic. This does not make it any less sci-fi than other media, but it is a significant distinguishing factor in what makes Star Trek unique even today. It contemplated themes of addiction, race, and the ethics of war and peace. At its core, Star Trek is an introspective and socially grounded series. It challenged the conceptions of the day and explored a genuine interest in human morality. In short, there is little here that uncannily mirrors its younger, more enlivened cousin. If we boil it down to the barest and most absolute vision of contrast, Star Trek is intellectual storytelling, while Star Wars is emotional. So why does this matter? Because we've been pitting 2 unlike cases against one another and fighting over them for 40 years now. This debate literally has its own Wikipedia page. But why do we feel so compelled to do so? Does it really boil down to the 2 sharing enough general similarities, on top of their names, that we have no other inclination than to compare them? Well, yes. It's very natural for us to juxtapose. It's part of how we understand ourselves and the world we live in. A better question to explore might be where exactly this debate has led us, and what comparing these 2 franchises actually reveals about each of them. In 2011, author Matt Forbeck published his book, Star Wars vs. Star Trek: Could the Empire Kick the Federation's Ass? And Other Galaxy-Shaking Enigmas.
Darth Vader could put the entire Borg collective in a vice grip with his mind.
Darth Vader has asthma.
If you couldn't tell from the title, this is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek analysis, but it's less on the level of narrative and thematic comparisons, and more so the lunchroom or playground debates over whether Obi-Wan could beat Jean-Luc Picard.
I'm a Sith Lord, and you're a bald guy in pajamas.
In fact, the book isn't really interested in juxtaposing tone or characters or themes at all. It's more engrossed in whether a lightsaber can deflect a phaser beam. The book does actually contain a foreword from actor Tim Russ, which begins with the concession that finding common elements between the 2 franchises to serve as a sincere basis for comparisons is difficult. Jeremy Bulloch, the original Boba Fett, also has a foreword, in which he too conflates the series as being within the same genre, while simultaneously acknowledging their vast differences. Forbeck concludes his book with the thesis that both franchises offer different things, and neither is necessarily better than the other, but more divisive, conclusive takes have come out of the ether. In 1999, sci-fi author David Brin wrote an article for the site Salon describing that he was boycotting The Phantom Menace, because George Lucas had, as he put it, an agenda. Brin argued that Star Wars pushes a series of, quote, moral lessons, parading them as good and true, like the right to rule being inherited and that genetics determine your ability to act as a leader, which, when we look at the King Arthur influences, along with other classical European folktales, yeah, David, that's kind of the point. Brin does acknowledge the Joseph Campbell influences and the way classic myth, which Star Wars emulates, captivates the human heart, but he asserts that the film's themes are morally confused, empty, elitist, and absolutist, and that Star Trek, by contrast, quote, tries to grapple with genuine issues, giving complex voices even to its villains, and asking hard questions about pitfalls we may face while groping for tomorrow. Covering this article could be an entire video in and of itself, and Brin does raise some interesting points, but his general analysis is echoed in multiple arenas by other critics. Star Wars is big, emotional, and sweeping, though not terribly concerned with the intellectual. Star Trek is thoughtful, morally inquisitive, and philosophical, but has less mass appeal. In 1998, J.C. Hertz wrote for the New York Times, "The Star Trek universe was founded on ham-fisted dialogue and gong show caliber acting. I'm Captain Kirk!" But the fictional science has always been brilliant. The science in Star Wars is nonsense, and everyone knows it, but no one cares because Star Wars isn't about science. It's epic drama. It's about those incredibly well-developed characters and the moral decisions they face. People don't get into debates about how the second Death Star works. They get into debates about the ethics of blowing it up.
Star Wars is like philosophy for children.
In his essay, Star Trek and Star Wars, The Enlightenment versus the Anti-Enlightenment, George A. Gonzalez described that Star Trek was concerned with the matter of social cohesion, of the ability of humanity to effectively grow up.
We've grown out of our infancy.
Star Trek's politics were grounded on the bedrock of progress, overcoming prejudice, poverty, war. Star Trek is the Enlightenment. In contrast, Star Wars is the anti-Enlightenment. The Force is one example Gonzalez cites, writing, "It is explicitly anti-Enlightenment insofar as it is outside of rationality, science, and yet plays a central political role in society." Noteworthy is the fact that under the Galactic Republic, legal slavery is extant. In the periphery, the great unwashed masses remain the great unwashed masses, regardless of history or circumstance. Thus, in a sense, in the world of Star Wars, there is no history, in terms of understanding the progress of social political evolution. History in Star Wars is simply documenting which Jedi or Sith were politically dominant at any given time. Otherwise, society and the masses stay essentially the same over millennia. But does the franchise debate actually have value? Does pitting them against each other reveal anything deeper? As comparison often does, it's inspired each of these series to analyze one another, and ultimately inspire one another. William Shatner himself has described the relationship as being symbiotic. George cited Star Wars as a major influence when he wrote the original trilogy, and it was that trilogy that revitalized science fiction within film and catalyzed the production of Star Trek's theatrical releases. Humans like to compare things because comparison allows us to look at something from a slightly different angle. It gives us a new lens to look through. It's easy to apply the lens of which is better to a comparative analysis, but in the case of apples and oranges, it invites us to take a step backwards to find the bigger picture. Neither of these series are terribly alike, and they never really have been, but that's why we can appreciate them both. They aren't fighting over the same territory, they're neighbors. And it's safe to say that each has inspired the other with every decade they've spent changing and developing.
I like Star Wars. It was the young King Arthur growing up and slaying the evil emperor finally. Everything doesn't have to create a philosophy for you for your whole life. You can also have fun.
It seems like this rivalry has thankfully catalyzed more good than bad. These days, Star Trek and Star Wars fans don't appear to harbor the same hostility they used to. And there is a greater acknowledgement that they really are more different than they are alike. They were just close enough that the proximity inspired a rivalry, and that rivalry inspired passion. It's almost a reflection of Gene Roddenberry's hope for the future.
A lot has changed in the past 300 years. People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We have eliminated hunger, want, the need for possessions. We've grown out of our infancy.
The real question is whether Star Wars fans can live in harmony with each other.
Turn off the flash, you fucking moron!
If you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. If you'd be interested in seeing more, there is bonus content on the Patreon linked in the description, but simply leaving a like or commenting is also a huge help to the channel. I'd also like to thank every channel supporter and member of said Patreon for making videos like this one possible. Do you have any history with either of these franchises? Let me know in the comments, and until the next episode, live long and prosper.